Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe, I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, I read a news story yesterday that just blew my mind, and I wonder whether you also heard or read this story. Apparently, Earth's rotational axis has been moving in recent decades. I didn't know anything about this, but scientists have been trying to figure out why that's happening, and they figured it out, and that's what the story was. Accelerated melting of the polar ice caps combined with the depletion of groundwater reserves in drought-ravaged places in the world, like the southwestern United States, has actually made the Earth's axis tilt a little over the last few decades. Isn't that incredible? Had you heard about this?
I had, I think, heard about the axis tilting. I did not hear about the explanation. Doesn't that not sound like a Hollywood movie where there's some disaster and a ruggedly handsome scientist is the only one who can save us?
Yes, and you read my mind, because when I saw this headline in yesterday's paper, my first thought was, oh my God, is this going to say that the Earth is now careening toward the sun? You know, we only have 6 months to live or something like that. That was my first thought.
Right.
Which is the Hollywood movie plot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we need is some geologist, possibly, or an astrophysicist who has like a grisly, 5 o'clock shadow, which shows that he's a serious person. And his life is a little bit in disarray because maybe his wife left him because of his obsession with science. But now is his moment to shine and to strap himself into the space shuttle and solve this problem in 20 minutes.
Right. With the help of his sexy colleague.
Ideally, yes.
The other scientist. Yes.
Yes.
So on to today's topic, and I realize this is going to be the third time in the last 4 episodes of Mansplaining that you and I tackle an overtly economic theme.
Mm-hmm.
3 episodes ago, you asked me about the connection between productivity and leisure. And last time I asked you about what a debt ceiling default would mean.
Right. So 2 humanities majors once again delve into economics to explain it to the world.
Yes, I know. That's kind of the point I was going to make. So this time I'm asking you about deficits and whether they really matter. And I thought it was a natural progression from the last question about the debt ceiling, because I've heard a lot in recent years about how deficits don't really matter so much. And recent economic events have kind of proven the case that a lot of liberal economists are making, that the deficit is overblown and our concerns about it are out of proportion to the actual danger. So I asked you to investigate that claim, and I'm really interested to hear what you found.
Well, thank you as always for your question. I feel that the word deficit is one of those words in our political discourse that's used very frequently, and yet it's almost never examined in itself. So thank you for this opportunity to drill down into it.
Yeah.
I know growing up, I heard a lot about our nation's budget deficit, how it was ballooning out of control, and how it amounted to the equivalent of parents running up a huge debt and leaving it to their children and grandchildren to pay the bill. And through this lens, deficit spending is completely irresponsible, a sterling example of short-term thinking that has led us into a situation that is unsustainable and possibly financially ruinous. But is that correct, or is it overblown? As with all economic topics, there are intelligent people who disagree on the point, but I'll do my best to present the various sides, and then we can make up our own minds on the matter.
Okay, good.
First, a quick definition of terms. Deficit spending is when a government or organization spends more money than it brings in through revenue. For example, in the case of the U.S. deficit, we're talking about the total of taxes collected minus the cost of everything the government has approved, from military spending to Medicaid and Medicare benefits to NASA shooting satellites into space and everything else in between. We spend more than we take in, and so our nation is in deficit. This deficit is typically financed through borrowing, which can add to the national debt. Quick quiz, Joe. You mentioned in our last episode that the Clinton administration briefly managed to have a budget surplus. But do you know the last time the U.S. government was carrying no debt at all? When was the last time our nation was completely in the black?
I have no idea, but my guess, I'm just going to go with my gut here, never. Is that the answer? Never?
It's close to never. The answer is between 1835 and 37 when Andrew Jackson was president. We are debt-free from that period, and so we're coming up pretty close now to the 200th anniversary of going back into debt.
Yeah, and frankly, I'm surprised that it's ever been the case. So Good for Andrew, I guess.
One of the first things I discovered in researching this topic is the fact that changing attitudes toward national budget deficits presents a pretty interesting way to look at the history of economics. Because our understanding of deficits and the effects they may or may not have on the economy has evolved significantly over time. We will eventually get to modern monetary theory, which you referenced in your question, but first we need to spend a bit of time with that theory's intellectual precursors. So let's start with the 18th and 19th centuries, when economics as a discipline was first taking shape. Pioneers of the field like Adam Smith and David Ricardo believed in the importance of balanced budgets and limited government interference in the economy, which Smith articulated with his idea of the quote-unquote invisible hand that more or less magically transforms selfish economic activity by individuals into a collective good enjoyed by everyone. And he believed that the market worked best when it was left to its own devices. Joe, do you remember reading Adam Smith and the Common Core in college?
Yeah, I sure do. Freshman year.
Oh, yeah. First time delving into that topic and never came back to it.
Yes, right. I don't remember loving it.
Yeah. In part, this point of view was a function of the times. Most governments were still on the gold standard at the time, and that constrained their ability to print money and engage in deficit spending in the first place. Almost as a necessity, fiscal conservatism ruled the day. However, the Great Depression of the 1930s forced many people to rethink these foundational assumptions. The best known of these rethinkers was the economist John Maynard Keynes, known today as the father of modern macroeconomics.
And who I spoke about at length in our productivity and leisure episode, too.
Absolutely. Keynes broke with classical economics by arguing that during economic downturns, government deficits could stimulate demand and pull the economy out of a recession. Keynes, it should be noted, did not argue for governments to spend some more no matter what. His idea was that they should pursue a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, increasing spending in periods of economic downturn and reducing it when times were good. His big break from classical economics was in this idea that the government should actively intervene in the economy and use spending strategically to inject money into the economy during down times. Keynes argued for a multiplier effect, in which an increase in government spending would lead to increased consumer spending, business investment, and job creation, creating a positive feedback loop of economic growth. He also argued that the government should direct its spending towards investing in infrastructure, education, and other long-term projects to promote economic development. In this way, deficit spending could yield long-term benefits, such as improved productivity, increased employment, and enhanced economic potential.
Yeah, now that sounds very modern.
Yeah. Like I said, though, he was not an advocate of permanent deficit spending. He believed it's important to return to budget surpluses during periods of economic expansion to ensure long-term fiscal sustainability. And this was right about the same time that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to his first term as president. FDR embraced Keynes's ideas as part of his New Deal package of legislation, which funded, via deficit spending, enormous public works projects, such as the construction of the Hoover Dam, as a way of combating unemployment and putting money back into the economy in the expectation that it would stimulate business growth and economic recovery. And then World War II came along, which forced the government to run even bigger deficits and pump even more money into the economy.
And I mentioned in our last session how the debt limit also ballooned from $45 billion to $300 billion during World War II.
Right. Yeah. The debt limit is something that was instituted during World War I, so it would have been a factor during these things.
Right.
Keynes's ideas were taken up by many countries throughout the world, especially during the post-war era. And the rise of social programs and the welfare state in the decades after the war pushed government spending ever higher. Not every economist agreed, though, that Keynesian economics and deficit spending were what pulled the U.S. out of the Depression. By the late 20th century, neoliberal economists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek rose to prominence, arguing for the importance of free markets, deregulation, and limited government intervention. Friedman, who, of course, taught at our alma mater, the University of Chicago, was an advocate of monetarism, which is an idea not that far from what Adam Smith argued centuries before, that the best course of government is mostly to avoid intervening in the economy at all.
Right.
Monetarism argues that controlling the supply of money is key, and that it is important to avoid pumping money into the economy since more money in circulation can lead to inflation.
He was an economic originalist, much the way some of the right-wing justices on the Supreme Court are legal originalists.
Yeah. You might call him an economics fundamentalist, which I think you can also say about the Constitution for some of our Supreme Court justices.
Right. With Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations as the stand-in for the U.S. Constitution, where he derives his originalism.
Right. Yeah. It's their Bible.
Yeah.
Keynes, it should be noted, was fully aware that government spending could increase inflation, but he argued that monetary policy, namely increasing interest rates, could be used to keep inflation under control. Raising interest rates can have negative consequences, though, since doing so makes it more expensive for businesses to borrow money, which can have the effect of decreasing investment and slowing down job creation. Friedrich Hayek, meanwhile, argued that government intervention in the economy makes markets less efficient and constrains individual freedom, since it would inevitably serve to benefit certain segments of the economy more than others, and therefore would limit a consumer's freedom to choose where they would spend or invest their money. Now, this may seem like a strange point of view, but you might recognize it as a libertarian way of thinking. Neoliberal economics and libertarianism fit together like hand in glove. Both Hayek and Friedman self-identified as libertarians. The neoliberal school of thought, which was adopted and turned into policy by the Reagan administration, made a virtue of fiscal austerity and held that reducing deficits and public debt are essential for fiscal discipline and market confidence. The global financial crisis of 2008, though, forced a lot of people to re-examine these ideas. Governments worldwide implemented stimulus measures, running significant deficits to counteract the economic downturn, and recently economists such as Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, and Oliver Blanchard have been influential in advocating for the use of deficits to combat recessions, in other words, classic Keynesianism. Another school of thought has gained attention in recent years, and you mentioned it in your question. Modern monetary theory, or MMT. MMT is a big change of pace from classical economics. When the government increases spending, it injects money into the economy and potentially raises inflation. Both Keynes and the neoliberal economists argued that the government's best means to control inflation is monetary policy, primarily raising interest rates. MMT argues that the best check on inflation is to raise taxes, since that also serves to pull money out of the economy and put it back into government coffers. For MMT proponents such as Warren Mosler and Stephanie Kelton, inflation isn't so much to be avoided as to be controlled, and deficit spending is perfectly fine so long as it does not lead to excessive inflation or resource constraints. They argue that deficit spending should be regarded strategically as an opportunity to invest in such things as building out infrastructure, addressing income inequality, and achieving full employment through a federal job guarantee program that would provide a base-level government job to everyone who otherwise can't find work. For MMT, it's not the size of the deficit that's really important. Unemployment and price stability are much bigger concerns and should be given much more attention.
Right.
To my eyes, MMT looks like the ideological opposite of neoliberal economics. The latter argued for fiscal conservatism and a government that does its best to stay out of the economy and allow the market to solve its own problems. For the neoliberals, a balanced federal budget is the best possible scenario, and spending should be reined in to make that possible. Meanwhile, MMT argues on behalf of strategic deficits, even when the economy is doing well, and an activist government, and believes that a laissez-faire attitude when people are suffering from poverty and unemployment is a clear sign that the government is not doing everything it can for all its citizens. And I feel like they're both a little naive in their own way. The neoliberals assume that a free market will sooner or later benefit every member of a society, through trickle-down economics or what have you, despite the many centuries of evidence we have that market forces disproportionately benefit certain segments of society, often at the expense of other segments.
Yes.
MMT, on the other hand, requires a government that is capable of three things. First, it needs to have a clear, accurate, and timely understanding of the economy and what ails it. Second, it needs to have the political will and ability to raise taxes as needed, not every now and then when a certain party is in power, but consistently over time. And third, it has to be able to act quickly and effectively to address problems as they arise. I feel like we also have centuries of evidence, some of it quite recent, that governments tend to struggle with all three of those things.
True, although I would say that democratic administrations in recent decades are better able to meet the challenges of all three that you just mentioned than Republicans are.
I would tend to agree, but I'm not sure how confident I am in MMT as an economic philosophy if it's only enacted at the times when Democrats are in control of both the White House and Congress.
Yes.
That's going to be too small of a window really to have a long-term effect, and it'll be too easy to be reversed, replaced, and demeaned.
I completely agree. You can say all you want about raising taxes in times of crisis, but if your partners in government are not willing to do that and will filibuster or something like that, it's dead in the water. So what's the point of having the philosophy if you can't ever implement it?
Well, I imagine the thinking is that if you can articulate the philosophy powerfully enough, then maybe you can win over some converts in the middle of the aisle, to the extent there is a middle at this point.
Yes.
But that's at best a long-term project and at worst a pipe dream. But maybe we can be optimistic.
Right. I guess the question becomes, and maybe you're going to address this now, whether the facts of the recent fiscal crises and how we've come through them accrue to the benefit of MMT as opposed to the neoliberal approach, you know? Because you don't have to proselytize to the people. All you have to do is show them that, well, we had this crisis and this is what we did. We passed 3 programs of massive spending, $5 trillion during COVID, and we got out of the crisis quickly, thus proving the merits of modern monetary theory. At least that, it seems to me, that's what you do. That's the way to get the people on board.
Yeah, it could be. And I agree this is the time to circle back to your original question. Do deficits matter? I think I've established that there is no consensus among economists on that question. Keynes has won the day to the extent that most economists agree with him on the idea of countercyclical fiscal policy and the use of deficit spending to pull an economy out of a recession. However, a lot would argue that the deficit should then be reduced when the economy is strong.
Yes.
Some people argue that the fact that foreign governments like China own a lot of the U.S. debt, and currently China holds between 5 and 7% of total U.S. debt, that's a risk because China could use the threat of dumping those securities to gain leverage in a foreign policy crisis. Others, though, argue that if China does threaten to call in its loans to the U.S., other governments would simply step up to purchase the debt and things would go on as before. So here, once again, there are conflicting viewpoints. My own feeling is that the question may not matter in the sense that deficits don't meaningfully influence our elected representatives. We don't have a $30 trillion deficit today because of economic theory. We have it because it's always been easier for politicians in this country to raise spending on social programs or defense spending than it is to raise taxes. They win more votes by doing the former, and they would lose votes by doing the latter, so all the incentives keep our representatives on course to increase the deficit forever and ever.
Right.
But that begs the question, Are we sticking our children and grandchildren with a huge bill that they'll need to find some way to pay off? There are some projections that within 30 years, half of all federal revenue might be earmarked towards simply paying off the interest on the debt. However, the government's interest payments as a percentage of GDP have been falling. In the mid-1990s, interest was 3% of America's GDP compared to 1.5% in 2021. Some economists, therefore, say that the threat of being overwhelmed by interest is similarly overblown. Meanwhile, there's a rule of thumb in economics that a nation's debt starts to cut into its economic growth once it passes 77% of the nation's gross domestic product. And Joe, do you know how much of a percentage of GDP our current debt stands at?
I do not. I hope it's below 77.
Unfortunately, no. The U.S. sovereign debt currently stands at 125% of GDP. And in non-pandemic years, it's been growing by 5 or 6% every single year. And yet, America's economy continues to grow. Joe, you're not a huge fan of high-tech gadgets, I think it's fair to say.
That's fair to say, yes.
But you could argue that Silicon Valley and the rapid growth of the technology sector has bought America a few more decades before it needs to come to terms with the long-term effects of our national debt. Or maybe the digital economy will give way to the AI economy, which will give way to some new economy after that, and we can just continue growing our way out of the debt spiral and render the deficit mostly irrelevant. Or possibly the AI economy will bring us Skynet, a war between humans and machines, and eventually a force of unstoppable android terminators who look like Arnold Schwarzenegger and are designed to hunt the human race to extinction. That would also have the effect of rendering the deficit mostly irrelevant. No one knows for sure. Economics as a discipline has a much better track record at making sense of history than it does at predicting the future. It's all pretty speculative, so let's speculate. What do you think we should do with the national debt based on what I said today? Should we bring it down or should we raise that pie higher?
I think I agree that in good times, we should be trying to lower the debt, as President Clinton did in the 1990s. But I don't think we should be as panicky about debt and deficits as we've been over the last several decades. That's my feeling about it. I think part of this, Mark, when you mentioned sticking our grandchildren with a bill, and your very first point at the top of the podcast about how arcane and mysterious the deficit is, I think part of the problem is that the American people equate government debt with household debt, right? Mm-hmm. We know our household debt, that's something we can relate to.
Right.
We know that we can't spend more than we take in month after month after month. Something's got to give. We'd have to declare bankruptcy, or we'd have the collection agents at our doorstep, the sheriff, etc. But that's not the way governments work. You know, I think it's an apples to oranges comparison that's just completely misguided and pernicious, really, because governments can print money. Governments can raise taxes.
Yeah.
Households can't do that. Governments can pay off immense debt. Governments can carry immense debt over decades of time because of all the tools at their disposal. Households can't do that. So for anybody, and I'm thinking of Republican politicians again, who equates the government's fiscal situation to the household fiscal situation, it's a complete red herring. It's just not true. And it's informed a lot of people's perceptions about what's going on and led to the panicky feeling about debt and deficits. I mean, what do you think?
I think you're right. I know personally that I've heard the U.S. debt compared to a credit card debt, and those are apples and oranges. I also can't help but notice that there are so many times when we have been told, just within our own lifetime, that the debt is an imminent crisis that needs to be solved, or bad things are going to happen. And yet years and years and decades go by and bad things don't happen. And at some point, you do kind of need to ask the question,
yes,
is that just a boogeyman?
Yes.
Like, is there a monster beneath this bed? Or is it just a scary story that we tell ourselves? Either because we misunderstand the nature of the problem or because we're trying to manipulate people.
Right. I think the nuanced answer to that question is the very reason why we constructed these last two episodes as a two-part episode. Defaulting on our debt is indeed a crisis, as I demonstrated in our last episode. But running high deficits is not a crisis, as you demonstrated in this episode.
Right.
So that's the nuanced answer to the question.
Yeah, if you draw a line in the sand and you say don't go above 77% of GDP, and then we do go above 77% and nothing happens, then either your math is wrong or that line should never have been drawn in the first place. And so far, no one that I know of has gone back and said, oh yeah, okay, we see where we got this wrong. This is why this happened.
Right.
This is why at 125% of GDP, things seem to still be going pretty well. Like something here needs to be either rethought or the argument needs to be taken off the table.
Right. Agreed. And that's why modern monetary theory is so interesting to me, because it really attacks a lot of the received wisdom of classical economics and demonstrates that a lot of it is just bullshit, And we need to embrace contrarian thinking when it's got facts behind it.
Yeah.
There's one other thing I wanted to mention. I had a question all lined up for you about how modern monetary theory reckons with inflation, but you kind of answered it by saying that really it's unfair to MMT to pin the current inflation on the spending we did post-COVID, because as you pointed out, MMT advocates would argue that we should have embraced fiscal policy by raising taxes or decreasing spending in order to bring our economic house in order and allow for that increased spending after COVID.
Yeah.
So it's unfair to hang inflation around their necks.
Right. If there's one thing that every school of economics agrees on, it's that inflation is bad. They just have different mechanisms of how best to resolve it. Yes.
But here's what I want to say about that. Even if you assume that the $5 trillion we spent in the end of the Trump administration, beginning of the Biden administration, dealing with COVID, bringing the United States back to its feet after the staggering blow of the COVID pandemic, even if we argue that that led directly to inflation, I still think there's an argument to be made that it was money well spent. Because what's the alternative? The money we spent post-COVID led to immediate job growth, led to all those lost jobs coming back almost instantaneously. Our economic rebound was fast. The country recovered much quicker than we did during the Paul Ryan imposed austerity after the Great Recession. So, inflation is receding. And you can make an argument that inflation is really due to all the supply chain bottlenecks and the lack of inventory that we had in this country during those key months in 2020 and 2021. But as supply chains go back to normal, inflation is receding. The virus is not a pandemic anymore. It's endemic. And that makes all the difference. So my point is, as bad as it is, there is an even worse fate than high inflation, and that would have been a moribund, staggering economy that is growing at fitfully low rates and keeping millions of people unemployed and miserable, and that's not what we have today.
Sure, yeah. And certainly if there's something that's unequivocally worse than inflation, it's unemployment. Because without employment, obviously earnings are way down and you're frightened about the future. And so your spending is going to go even further down.
Yes.
And so inflation discourages spending, but unemployment kind of eliminates it to a large extent, except on the absolute necessities. And so if the spending kept employment running, if the spending kept businesses operating, then even if inflation went up, there might have been more gain than cost.
Yes, that seems patently obvious to you and me, but I don't think a lot of mainstream economists agree with us here. I don't think Lawrence Summers agrees with us, and he's a moderate Democrat.
Uh-huh.
I think a lot of people think that inflation is this god-awful thing that needs to be curbed at whatever cost, even if it means unemployment going back up to stratospheric 8% plus highs.
Yeah.
And I just think they're wrong about that.
I wonder if the specter of inflation, as we can see it happening right now in other countries, just kind of scares them a little bit. Because for instance, Argentina, people are spending money just to spend it, because if they leave it in their wallet, it will lose so much value over the course of a few days that it will be essentially worthless. And so I think people who think about this all the time, maybe for them, inflation is the boogeyman, because it's been the actual boogeyman that they've been seen operating in the world, the thing that has reared its head and made people's lives almost impossible. And so they're hyper vigilant against anything that might lead to inflation that could, in a worst case scenario, kick off an inflationary spiral that maybe gets out of control.
Yeah, that may be true, but I also think it fundamentally comes down to whether you are a cheerleader for the market or whether you're a cheerleader for people, you know?
Yeah.
I think a lot of right-leaning economists are market boosters. The fate of the world hangs in balance of where the market is. And they're not thinking about the fate of people. Unemployment is less important to them than inflation. That's people's lives. That's not the market.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's a part of the fundamental dichotomy here. And the proponents of MMT, I think it's more people-based economics.
Yeah. Do you feel like I answered your question?
Yeah, I do feel like you answered it. And I think you landed kind of where I thought you would land, which is there is a boogeyman phenomenon out there, and this might be one of the things that falls into it, and we need to take a more measured approach. So
yeah, that's this humanities major's opinion at any rate.
Right.
Okay, so you're ready for your question for next time?
I am, yes. I hope it's not about economics.
I'm afraid that it kind of is. It kind of is.
Okay.
For our next episode, I'd like to ask you about 3 letters, UBI. UBI, or Universal Basic Income, is a solution that is sometimes floated for the disaster scenario in which large swaths of the population are put out of work by automation or AI, robotics, or what have you. The core idea of the universal basic income is that governments could just take unemployment and poverty out of the equation by supplying every single citizen with enough money to get by. After that, whether you worked to earn more money would be up to you. I've read that some governments are experimenting with UBI on a limited trial basis. On the one hand, this sounds like a pretty good idea, though I'm pretty sure there are some Americans, libertarian economists in particular, who would absolutely hate it. So my challenge to you, Joe, is to please read up on universal basic income and come back with the best arguments on both sides of this issue, both pro and con, and then you and I can decide who's right.
Okay, will do. Here I thought you were going to ask me about the NBA draft, and you come back at me with UBI. But that's an interesting subject. I look forward to reading more about it.
I look forward to hearing about it.
Okay, and that's a wrap for another episode of Mansplaining. And this is the time in the podcast where we tell you how much we'd like to hear back from you with a review or a rating of the podcast. You can find this podcast, if you don't know this already, pretty much everywhere you listen to podcasts. If you haven't listened in a while, we'd love if you checked out our growing library of content. And you can also engage with us on our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. Please like us there if you're enjoying listening to these episodes. Check our sources. Leave us a comment or a question. And of course, give us a 5-star rating if you're so inclined. We also have a phone number where you can call us with questions or comments, and we'd really love to get questions from our audience of future topics that we can discuss on Mansplaining. That phone number is 206-486-4074.
Operators are standing by.
Yes. But it's time for us to go. That's all for now. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.